Mary Ainsworth formulated this study. During this experiment, an infant is introduced to an unfamiliar setting with their caregiver. The infant will go through 2 separations and reunions with the caregiver. The infant's patterns of behavior are observed to depict type of attachment.
Caregiver and infant enters unfamiliar room where they are left alone to play. At this point, the infant is prompted by the caregiver to play. The caregiver is cued to sit and let infant play on its own. This is where we should observe a secure base. The introduction of a stranger should induce stranger anxiety. The stranger is cued to walk into the room and sit down, making no attempt to interact with the infant. The stranger then talks to the caregiver. The infant is cued by the caregiver that the stranger is okay. The stranger is then cued to interact with the infant and begin play. Shortly after the caregiver is cued to leave, we will be observing first separation anxiety. During the first reunion, we observe the infant's reaction to the caregiver. The stranger is cued to leave so that the caregiver and the infant is left alone to play. The infant is happy to see the caregiver and commence play instantaneously. The caregiver is cued to leave so that second separation anxiety can be observed. The stranger is then cued to go back into the room. At this point, we are observing the ability of the infant to be soothed by the stranger. A secure infant can be soothed by the stranger. The caregiver is then cued to come back into the room and greet the infant and offer it comfort. During the second reunion, we are observing the infant's reaction to the caregiver. A secure baby would be very excited and happy to see their caregiver and commence play. Parent and infant enters room. The infant is placed down near toys but stays close to its caregiver. The infant is not interested in commencing play, but rather hyper-focused on the caregiver. Caregiver then sits down, and an insecure, resistant infant would follow its caregiver and not explore. The stranger that enters the room, we then observe stranger anxiety. With an insecure, resistant infant, it's observed that the infant ignores the stranger and continues to be hyper-focused on the caregiver. The stranger then commences interaction with the infant and tries to induce it in play, though with the insecure, resistant infant, it's not interested.
As the caregiver leaves, we will observe separation anxiety.
It's okay, he's gonna come back. It's fine. It's okay. Okay, what about this one? Do you like this one?
We will now see the reaction to the first reunion with the caregiver. The insecure, resistant infant is difficult to comfort. The infant pushes away toys. She wants contact with the caregiver, but she resists comfort. We will now see separation anxiety again. The stranger enters, and we are looking for stranger anxiety and the ability to be soothed by a stranger. The infant starts to crawl away from the stranger. The insecure, resistant infant is not interested in play. The caregiver enters for the final reunion where we are looking for the infant's reaction. The infant wants contact with her caregiver, but she resists comfort. Caregiver carries infant into an unfamiliar room. The infant is placed down, and because she is insecure and avoidant, she immediately begins play while ignoring her caregiver. The insecure, avoidant infant continues to play while the caregiver sits down. We are now observing stranger anxiety with the insecure, avoidant infant. The insecure, avoidant infant does not have stranger anxiety as she avoids the stranger. The stranger and caregiver will talk for a minute. When the caregiver leaves the room, we are observing for separation anxiety. As you can see, the infant does not react to the caregiver leaving. She continues to play on her own without interacting much with the stranger. The caregiver is entering the room for the first reunion. The insecure, avoidant infant is avoiding the caregiver. The caregiver will now leave for the second separation. We are observing, again, separation anxiety, and the insecure, avoidant infant does not have any. As the stranger enters the room, we will now observe stranger anxiety and the ability to be soothed by a stranger. The insecure, avoidant infant does not need to be soothed by the stranger, and she displays no stranger anxiety. As the caregiver enters the room, we will observe the reaction to the reunion, and the infant continues to ignore him. The disorganized and disoriented infant has a confused look on her face as her caregiver brings her into the unfamiliar room. The infant is clingy and unsure what to do. We will now look for a secure base as the caregiver gets up to sit down. The disorganized and disoriented infant does not know what to do. She will approach her dad because she is still clingy, and she expresses confusion with her facial expressions. The stranger enters the room, and we are looking for stranger anxiety. The disorganized and disoriented infant shows no consistent way of coping. She is confused, and she is still clingy with her father. She also avoids the stranger. We are now going to observe separation anxiety as the caregiver leaves the room. The disoriented and disorganized infant is puzzled but does not seem to react. We will now observe the reaction to the first reunion of the caregiver. As you can see, the infant fears the caregiver but simultaneously wants to approach him for comfort. The caregiver will leave the room to observe the second separation. The disoriented and disorganized infant will display traits of the three other attachment styles. She is confused, angry, and sad. The stranger enters the room to comfort the infant. We will observe stranger anxiety and the ability to be soothed by a stranger. The disoriented and disorganized infant is fearful, angry, and resists comfort. The caregiver returns for the final reunion. The infant again wants comfort from her caregiver while simultaneously fearing him.